Hello and welcome to Practice Tests Academy's Strategic Case Study Revision videos. What we're going to be doing over the course of a series of 3 videos is looking at the E3, F3 and P3 OT exam material, but from the perspective of the case study, the strategic case study. Now, the strategic case study at this level is all about leadership, business strategy, dealing with reputational issues, change management. It's very sort of people and commercial acumen orientated. In many ways, it's much less technical than the earlier case studies at managerial and operational. At this level, because of that focus on business strategy, E3 is naturally the lead paper. Now, don't go back to your OT exam notes when you're preparing for this exam. It's not, as we just said, a very technical paper. You've passed the E3, F3 and P3 papers. The material from those papers is examined in a very, very different way in this exam. For example, in F3 you had all that detailed calculations work that you got to grips with as far as hedging is concerned, and how you construct futures and options hedges and so on. That's not going to be examined again. You've passed that exam. So if hedging was to come up in this exam, it'd be far more likely something along the lines of should we hedge at all? Which hedging instruments or techniques should we use? What are the pros and cons of the different ones, and what do you recommend? You won't be getting into doing detailed calculations. So you shouldn't sit for hours and hours with your old E3, F3 and P3 material trying to relearn it. What you should focus on is question practice for this particular case study. Now, you need to get hold of as many mocks as you can based on the real pre-scene, and try and source those mocks from providers that will give you feedback. So you can submit them for marking and get some comments back on your specific answers. That's my recommendation. As far as E3, F3 and P3 is concerned, these 3 videos are more than enough for the technical content of what you need for the strategic case. Industry life cycle is an important, if you like, positioning point. So you would think with the case study, fundamentally, what is the industry life cycle? What stage is it at? And the stage it's at will affect the level of competition, the level of profitability, where the industry is likely to be headed next. So, for example, if you're at the introductory phase, that's brand new ideas. If that tends to be risky because the idea might not take off, but if it does take off, then you can start expecting significant growth. If growth is starting to slow down, then this shakeout phase, often very painful, this one, as companies fight to continue to grow at the rate they always have done, when growth slows down, people start fighting more with each other to try and gain market share. So you get lots of corporate activity at the shakeout phase, companies failing, one company buying another. So lots and lots of corporate activity at the end of the growth phase. You then go into maturity. Coming into the maturity phase, you tend to find a smaller number of battle-hardened competitors, and also customers who have bought this product before, so they really know what they want. So you get a lot of competition on the basis of differentiation. Strong brands, lots of emphasis on marketing. Those kinds of ideas. The market is saturated at that point. That's when sales peak, and then it goes into decline, typically as our product looks set to be replaced with something else. And in the decline phase, particularly if there's an awful lot of exit costs from the industry, if it's expensive to leave, then you tend to find a more intense price competition at that phase. Because, if for example, to bow out of an industry is going to involve an awful lot of redundancy costs and dismantling plant and equipment and so on, then lots of companies will stave off having to pay those costs by just staying in the market a little bit longer and continuing to compete. And that can be quite intense competitively. Now, a good starting point is to think about what the fundamental objective is of the business that we are going to be dealing with in the case study. Quite often that organisation is a for-profit business, in which case we can assume
But the purpose behind the organisation is to maximise shareholder wealth. That's their primary objective. There will be secondary objectives supporting that, however, because they won't be able to maximise shareholder wealth unless they do things like look after the employees and keep the employees happy enough to stay involved, keep the customers happy enough to keep coming back to us, and so on. But the primary objective will be to maximise shareholder wealth. Other things will be the secondary objectives. Quite often, though, in a not-for-profit business, if you get one of those in the case study, the primary objective won't be to maximise shareholder wealth. It'll be something typically non-financial. It'll either be producing a product or a service that's sort of good for society as a whole. There will be financial secondary objectives because there's only a limited amount of money to spend. So they will have to produce value for money. But the primary objective will be different. And that colours everything that we do. Because if we're not trying to maximise shareholder wealth, then a lot of the decision-making criteria we have, like taking on projects with a positive MPV, that's geared more towards maximising shareholder wealth. So you would need to think really carefully if it was a not-for-profit type organisation. Now, just to remind you, value for money is a balance of three things. Economy, how much you spend on inputs. Efficiency, the ratio of inputs to outputs, it's how much has come out given what's gone in. And effectiveness, the quality of outputs, so whether or not we're hitting our primary objectives. Now, most organisations in the case studies are admittedly for-profit organisations, but they could be dealing with other organisations that aren't for profit, and that's how value for money and so on might get brought into the exam. Stuff that's very, very likely to happen, and if it happens, it'll be very serious. Maybe we should consider avoiding that altogether. So if investing in a certain market is very likely to go wrong and it would be disastrous if it does, well, maybe we don't invest in that market then. On the other hand, stuff that's not very likely to go wrong, and if it does go wrong, it's not very serious, then that's the kind of stuff where we might say it's not worth taking any further steps on that because it's just not a big deal for us. Stuff that's not that likely to happen, but if it happens it would be very serious, we might transfer that risk to somebody else. And the classic example of that is insurance. You know, the risk of your house burning down is probably, hopefully, a relatively low probability, but it will have a high impact. So we insure that, pass the risk on to an insurance company. Other examples of transferring would include potentially outsourcing somebody, so giving it as a job for somebody else to do. Or potentially getting your customer to sign a disclaimer saying if something goes wrong, you agree that it's not our fault, is one attempt at transferring the risk to somebody else. The home territory for internal controls is the blue box here, reduce. So every time it happens, it doesn't hurt me that much, but it seems to happen a lot, so it's adding up. If I owned a chain of shops, for example, shoplifting, I would probably put into that category. Every time somebody steals something from one of my shops, it doesn't cost me that much, but it seems to happen quite a lot. So what will I do? I'll install closed circuit television cameras, security guards, and so on, bleepers on the doors. Now, this is what's known as TARA analysis because of the initial letters here, transfer, accept, reduce, avoid. You don't necessarily have to feel in the exam, if you're making suggestions, that you have to do what TARA suggests. You don't have to, but you should consider it, if you like, strongly advisory as a way of coming up with suggestions. It's also a way of justifying what you're saying. So, for example, you might say, I think the risk of this happening is incredibly high. Probability is high and impact is high, so we should just avoid it. So that's how it's useful in the case study exam.